right, knock, knock. Howdy, folks. Hello from Nashville Skyline, and welcome to Dr. Ben and Friends, the podcast dedicating to putting the med in comedy. We're shining a big, bright spotlight on everyday healthcare heroes and comedians. Southern hospitality on full blast, Nashville style, where hospitality is sweeter than sweet tea. All right, I'm your host, Dr. Ben, your friendly neighborhood board-certified orthopedic surgeon by day and stand-up comedian by night. I can fix your hip and break the ice in the same day. All right, listeners, we've got a very special consult in the house today. Today, I'm teaming up with national mental health rock star, Dr. John Deloney. Dr. John, say hi to everybody.
Good to see everybody.
All right, we're going to hear more about Dr. John. His accolades read like a Encyclopedia Britannica, but we only have an hour. And then we also have a real-life healthcare hero, Dr. Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I like how you said that. We have this guy, and we have a real-life guy. That's awesome.
Healthcare hero. A dedicated physician specializing in child and adolescent psychiatric medicine. Can't wait to hear about what Dr. Brian does. That's right. The Dr. Ben and Friends podcast prescribes 100% comedy with zero copay. All right. Today we're celebrating the real-life healthcare heroes and comics who dedicate themselves to keeping you safe and laughing. Thank you both for joining us. A special thanks to our sponsor, The Needles Group in beautiful Marco Island, Florida. As a doctor, I know a great needle when I see one, and these realtors are the best in the business. Buying or selling? Let The Needles Group inject some serious value into your property game. TheNeedlesGroup.com. All right. What other questions do you have for our psychiatrist, Dr.
Can I ask you
John?
one more?
Yeah,
Please do. Keep them coming.
All right. So they're old, they're 20 years old now, but my diagnostics were OCD without the less compulsive behaviors.
Your
But
personal.
I had a brain that wouldn't shut off. Yeah. That would just ruminate all the time. And like pretty significant anxiety. So this happened, and I wanted you to tell me, terrible idea, or we need to be honest about this, okay?
Okay.
I went to an event about a year and a half ago. So this is all super recent. I've learned a lifetime of management strategies. When I was like 12 or 13, I remember begging my father for, at the time it was Ritalin was the go-to, please. And he was like, we don't know what it does, son. And he's an old Texas police officer, and he's like, I don't know what it's going to do. So we got to figure this out. And so the relief I begged for has become the life lessons to navigate the world that I use now, right? But it was a painful time. I went to an event, and I left this event with a bunch of, it was like Christmas bags. And in these Christmas bags was a metric ton of high-end, really nice nicotine pouches.
Okay.
And I tried to be cool and smoke when I was in college, and I thought I looked tough, but I felt terrible. I ran track. It was just stupid to do, right? And so I've been hearing that it's a nootropic, that it can help regulate brain chemistry for certain people in certain situations. I was like, I'm going to do an N=1 experiment on this. I'm going to try it out. So I read ads on my show every Monday morning. It takes about an hour and a half of me reading a teleprompter, which is a nightmare for me. So I didn't tell anybody, and I put one in, and I read my ads. And we got done in 45 minutes. And my producer was like, awesome, way to go. I didn't take another one for another week. The next Monday morning, I took one earlier, and then I put another one in as we got going. Long story short, I did it for 4 Mondays in a row, and I got it down to 27 minutes. We were ripping through those ads. And she came in, and she goes, hey, you've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now. This is when people start doing cocaine, if that's what you're doing. But she goes, keep doing it. She's like, we get a whole hour of our life back. And the only way I can describe it is nicotine for me is comically, insanely addictive. Like to a point that I always knew that, and I always rolled my eyes at it, like not me. It's wild how addictive it is. Like open your eyes, first thing you think about, going to bed at night thinking, I just need to sleep for 8 hours and I can, right? So it's wild addictive. But it also has it's like being in a football stadium before the game starts and everyone's just talking and eating nachos and it makes all that noise stop. And I didn't realize that noise was going on in the background of my head for all those years. And so what's the truth about it?
About nicotine?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Derived from, obviously not tobacco. That's the cancer causing stuff. But what's the truth about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a neurotransmitter, just like dopamine and everything else. I mean, that's how it's working. There's the nicotinic receptors. So I'm sure that it absolutely works on something. I don't know that we really have the studies right now to say like this is what it's doing and this is how to use it as a drug.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're gonna have it at some point. I mean, there's just like a ripe field right there.
We have a friend, a mutual friend who's a comic, Derek Stroop, and he has that great long bit about we should bring back cigarettes because cigarettes used to save Thanksgiving when Martha would step out on the porch, and it's a hilarious long comedy bit. But obviously, we can't bring back smoking because that's just so bad. But there's some truth to it.
Yeah. I don't think the pharmacologists are going to create a cigarette or even a vape. It's going to be a pill or a patch or an injection or something. But yeah, when we're using nicotine or some like nicotine derivative.
Yeah.
And much safer than cocaine.
I'm just kidding, of course. Dude, if I took cocaine, my head would spin off the top of my head. Yeah, I watch too many of that's one of those that I think is a true, not in a spiritual sense, but like it's a true demon. Like I've seen my really high performing, amazing young men and women head down that road. And that's one that just from a young age, like don't touch, stay away. I've never seen good on the other end of it.
Right. And heroin and methamphetamines.
Well,
on that list
Adderall's
also.
a methamphetamine, right?
Yeah.
Or it's not methamphetamine, but it's an amphetamine.
Well, methamphetamine you can prescribe. Like there's a branded methamphetamine for ADHD.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that one?
You've never prescribed it. Okay. Everything I've heard about it is like, is it really worth it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Could be a slippery slope.
Yeah. Well, it's a slippery slope, and now you're writing a prescription for methamphetamine, and it's going to put a target on everybody's back.
Yeah. That feels like my house is really cold, so let's set it on fire to warm it up. Like we can do that.
That's a good analogy.
But it's going to come at a pretty significant cost. We can warm this place up real fast.
Also, the pharmacology of it is not great compared to like Adderall.
Yeah,
Why would you?
What do we do about? Is it 75% of my graduate students that I was teaching in some shape, form, or fashion are using Adderall?
Oh yeah, I would believe that. Yeah,
I don't know what to. That can't be good over a long period of time.
Yeah, they're not even meeting the criteria for ADHD.
No.
It's
a wonder drug.
ADHD people.
Yeah,
it's a performance enhancing drug.
Yeah.
I think in 20 years we're going to have data of what's actually happened with that. It's definitely overprescribed.
And then it's, you can just, but it's used for young people who don't have ADHD or they don't have a clinical need for it. They take it as needed before an exam or when they're studying, and it works. That's the problem, is it works.
It does work, yeah. Yeah, they're not using it to treat ADHD. It is a performance enhancing drug.
But it's what I always say, like alcohol, if you've got a history of trauma, alcohol works. If you've got a history of, if you need to work for the next 48 hours without taking a break, cocaine works. It just will also kill you. It'll take everything from you too, right?
So what would be the pitfalls of this overprescribing? Everyone's on methamphetamines that don't need or don't meet criteria for it.
Yeah, a lot of this is looking at like future addiction, and now they've got something that who knows how they took it. Did they actually take this as prescribed, or was it, I really need to study, I'm going to take 10 of them and stay up for 2 days?
And then the one that spooked me with my college students was the studies with, and it may have been curbed. I've been out of that loop for almost half a decade now, but the amount of pills with fentanyl in them or that are cut with other stuff, that's like, it got to the point that I pulled my son and said, hey, listen, I never do this. You cannot take a pill from anybody for any, like Advil, ibuprofen, because they're stamped. They look perfect. You, like a clinician, I can't tell the difference between a fake Adderall pill and a real one. They're just so good. And so I was like, just
could be laced
nothing.
Or something.
Yeah, unless you get it from me or your mom. And he's like, okay, Dad. I'm like, no, really though, really. Yeah.
that could save his life.
Yeah.
So,
can I ask one more? Does Adderall have an escalating effect? Meaning, like kind of like nicotine, to get the same effect, you have to
higher
amp it, amp
doses.
it. But
yeah, especially like in those first few weeks, like that very first pill kind of feel the strongest.
Yeah.
And then you build up a tolerance
you
to
just
it.
chase the ghost forever.
Yeah, I don't know if you chase it forever, but you definitely chase it for a few weeks.
Okay.
And once you kind of hit that point, but you're not hitting a point of like being high, you're just hitting a point of function.
That's my concern. Yeah, is it raises the threshold for just basic functionality.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, if you're using it to get high, it is going to be a higher and higher threshold till eventually it's lethal.
Okay.
Just kind of
Man.
like opiates.
Those young people who are like got it prescribed at the age of 12 and now they're in college and now they're starting their first job or they're like, I think of y'all, like you're doing your 120 hour a week rotations and like, it just feels like it would have to just balloon.
It does a little bit, but also you metabolize it differently. So if you're going for function, you could usually keep the same dose or even decrease. Like a 12 or 13 year old may be your highest dose ever. And by the time you're at 25, you might be on a lower dose.
And that's my issue. Because
But
I don't know how to my wife can open a bag of gummy bears and eat 4 and put the bag in the drawer. I don't know how she can do that. So I know if I took that once, I would chase effect forever.
Yeah,
instead of chase function.
Yeah, if you're going for, I just want to kind of be the baseline the same as everybody else, there shouldn't be an issue. If it's, I want to be a superhero.
I need to feel yeah.
16 hours a day of like the highest performance I've ever had. Yeah, you're going to be higher.
That would
doses.
be me. I got to stay away from that. Yeah.
All right, let's keep the gummy bears away from Dr. John.
Oh man, I got a problem. What's the correlation between young people with NADHD and sugar intake?
No correlation.
None.
Oh,
well,
yes.
not causally.
Not causally,
but on the just the propping up.
Yeah. So we think it's environmental, and it's just if you were to give them a sugar-free, and it would be the same thing.
Same thing.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, because that's been the fear is don't give anybody like sugar on a road trip, or it'll be rough for 8 hours and
bouncing off the walls. But
yeah, as it turns out, there's not a lot of data there for.
No, for me, it doesn't make me bounce off. It stabilizes. It gets me to that place. Yeah.
I mean, you'll still have like the energy crash. Just, sure. I mean, nutritionists are going to be mad about that.
Get grumpy, yeah.
But yeah, it's not like you're not extra hyper.
All right, now it's time for common sense healthcare ads we wish existed. This episode of the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast is brought to you by Panic Popper. Anxiety spikes? Press that button on your Panic Popper. Carry this special button that sounds like this. And press it aggressively during stressful moments. The loud fart noises reset your fight or flight to fight or laugh. Instant calm. Warning, may cause social ostracism.
All right. And Dr. Brian, we'll kind of turn the tables here. Do you have any, do you enjoy comedy? Do you have any questions for comedians kind of behind the curtains of the comedy world? We're very experienced professional comedians.
The best, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How do you come up with your content? How do you get on stage and not freeze up? And how do you, I'll think of a new way to word this. How do you choose who your audience is going to be, basically? Like, how do you
Good question.
say, this is who I could really appeal to?
I like it. Dr. John?
I remember 20 years ago, Chris Rock in an interview saying this, and it has proven true in my life, that most comics are the third funniest friend in their friend group. So you have the one that's real funny, just naturally can rip stuff off. And they're usually the grumpiest, they've had the wildest life, or they do the dumbest things, but they're the funny one. And then you have the articulate, like the point, like, look at that guy. And like, oh yeah. And then the third funniest is the one who's able to take that stuff and package it in a way that an audience can hear. And the other thing he said that stuck with me is almost every one of his jokes started with a very serious conversation at a kitchen table. And so people are upset about a thing or they're frustrated about a thing. And that becomes, how can I make this, how can I bring a room of strangers together with a shared experience, and I'm going to point out how ridiculous or how awful or how whatever this is, right? You have a great bit about driving, right? And I can imagine there's been conversations with, I hate the stereotypes, I hate I don't like this, and being able to take that and say, here you go, and I'm going to hand it to you in a way that you can hear it and experience it with me. That's humor.
Someone's pet peeve.
Yeah. Or the thing that most of mine is stuff that makes me mad or frustrated, or somebody lied to me once. And how can I take that and subvert it with an audience there? I have struggled with the last question you asked, because I got into this kind of like you did. Like, I had another job, another life. I did this for a whole other reason. I have no intention of becoming like a famous comic or anything like that.
When did you start stand-up?
I 2 years ago.
Okay.
So, long story, my dad was an old Texas cop, and then he became a minister, and then that's why I'm in therapy. Cop and a minister for a dad, you're going to counseling. But we didn't talk a lot. We didn't have like banter, but he revered Steve Martin, Cosby, like before, Robin Williams and Richard Pryor. He would just say like, those are the guys. And so I just grew up like wanting to be like my dad. And so I was obsessed with George Carlin early on. And I used to listen to Steve Martin records and Cosby records over and over. I remember I had a spiral OCD, and I would try to find, why was this joke funny? Like the pacing. I just became obsessed.
Wow.
And I speak on stages for a living. And I had an existential crisis 2 years ago. I walked off stage and I was in the green room by myself. And I remember thinking, you're about to become that guy. 10 years from now, you're going to be telling the same stories, the same jokes, the same dramatic crisis moment that you walked in on. You're going to be that guy unless you do something radically different right now.
Wow.
And so me and a buddy put up at Zany's, and I said, he wanted to do it really bad. He wanted to be a comic. And I was like, all right, let's do a night. And because we both have big Instagrams because of our day jobs, it sold out immediately, and they added another show. And I was like, oh, this is happening. It's the single most nervous I've been in the last probably 25 years. Like, I was.
Describe that feeling, like before, during, the first time.
The only way I can describe it is this happened the other day. I recorded a show that I know has a giant audience to it. I recorded the show, went in and did a speech on the pathology of loneliness to 400 mental health professionals. And that night I had 8 minutes to do opening up for somebody at Zany's. The moment I opened my eyes, I started thinking about that 8 minutes. Like, it is consuming. Like, and that means I love it. And that means it's like it, right? But I get nervous every time.
Was that your first time doing stand-up?
Ever.
At the stage at Zany's, it wasn't like...
Yeah. But I get to cheat, though, because I speak for a living. And so I didn't realize that 90% of comedy is, can you handle yourself in front of an audience? So I've been doing that for years. And so that part wasn't hard. The hard part was there's just 100 or 300 strangers with their arms crossed that just spent money they probably don't have, and they got a sitter, and they paid for parking, and they're like, I needed a break from the world, go. And it's like, right. And so I get super nervous. But John Crist, a mutual friend of ours, he told me, because I started selling out rooms right away, and I thought it was going awesome. And he had great wisdom. He said, the people who buy tickets to see you are on your team, and they already have given you the benefit of the doubt by just walking in the door. You only will know if you're a comic if you can get on somebody else's stage who's there went to see somebody else, and can you rip that room? And I've learned the hard way, like, oh, I'm not as funny as I thought I was, right?
We're in the same boat there.
My mom thinks my jokes are funny. These strangers don't. And that's been so great. There's some comics, and we both know them, they work really hard over the course of a year, and they walk on stage, and the audience, you owe me. I worked hard on this. You owe me your laughs. And we also know some of the greatest comics are the ones who say, y'all, like, it's a horrible world out there. you all came in here, you put your phones in a bag for 2 hours to have a shared human experience. I want to be a good steward of your time and who you are. And so I think as a comic, when I walk out on stage, it's my job to give you all a break from the madness that's the world. And so it's less about how do I find people that are going to be my people. It's how can I come up with universally funny things and communicate them in a way. My set in Nashville it's a little bit different than the one in Huntsville, Alabama, right? And it's definitely different than the one in Texas. But can I say these things in a way that you can hear them, right?
I think Nate epitomizes that.
Is the best. And you and I both, I didn't realize this. Now that I've gotten to know some out-of-town comics, they're like, you know what you have isn't real. Like, it's not fair. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, the club in Nashville is so hospitable, and there's a general sense of everybody wants you to win. Mm-hmm. And you don't just have Nate and Aaron Weber and John Christ and Dusty Slay and Theo Von coming back and being like, that was a great joke. I got a way you can make it. Like, nobody else has that, right? And so there's
much more cutthroat.
Yeah. And so it's a sense of, we just kind of waltzed into a pretty unique environment that's really supportive of clean comics, of local comics, and the city kind of roots for you to do well. Like, people want you to do well. And I hear that in other places, they don't want you to do well because they want to be the one who does well.
Right.
And I've been on a bill where it was, here's the bill. It was just a Monday night where everybody goes up and does 10 minutes. It was Aaron Weber, followed by Nate, followed by John Christ, followed by me, followed by Dusty Slay, then Aaron Weber, then Brian Bay. And everyone was cooking. But it was like oh man, I want to go do good.
Right.
Not I want to badmouth your set. Like, I gotta go super good. I gotta go. And that for an audience, what a magic night, right?
Wow.
It's just awesome. Doing that with you is the same way, right? Doing a show with you is like, they came to see Dr. Ben and they know it's going to be awesome. Can I go be an awesome steward of what you're about to do? Can I get that wave so high that when you walk up, you can just surf for the whole, like,
and
that,
you do too.
Well, that's part of the fun for me, is how can I set the table so that Ben can come in and just wipe this thing out? That's awesome.
I hear the deafening laughter. I'm like, oh no, I got to follow Dr. John.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
like,
right.
You're not supposed to show up the headliner.
Right, yeah, right. I wish.
But we're in the same boat because, I notice when I go to my show, they're all there to see me and they're rooting for me. And then you go on another show and it's like, I got to win them over.
Yeah,
they don't know who I am.
Yep. Yeah.
And so, but I'm terrified too. And we're both kind of emerging, but I would probably have verified panic attacks. Like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And
yes. Yeah. And there's been several nights I drive home and I'm like, I'm going to get a plumber certification. Like, I don't need to be doing anything. And I will say this, the opposite side is my friends, and I love that I get to use that word because it's so hard to make friends as an adult. It's just hard, right? Especially when you move to a new town or new city,
right.
It's hard. These guys that are, and these men and women who become my friends, like I love that. They can't possibly imagine getting a call in the middle of the night and doing a rundown to verify if somebody's suicidal or not. Or they can't imagine, you cut somebody open today and took out part of their bones and took a hammer and beat the titanium into them. And this is 8 minutes is the hardest part of your day. And you're like, yes. Like, I love that they can't process that either as much as I can't process. You went to Bridgestone Arena and just told jokes to 17,000 people. Like, what? Right? So I love that what we take for granted in our day jobs is other people's worst nightmare. And whereas I'm like, oh gosh, can I make you laugh? Right. I just love that everyone's got a thing they do really well. And if you'll be awkward and weird, I don't know. That's the beauty of life.
Right. And I think stand-up comedy is much more terrifying and scary than surgery.
Yeah.
And I've been asked that before, was scarier, first time doing surgery or first time doing stand-up comedy. And definitely stand-up comedy was just terrifying.
It's easily the scariest thing that I'm a part of.
Have you ever had any thoughts of doing an open mic or anything, Dr. Brown?
Oh, absolutely not. Are you kidding me?
You work with ADHD parents. You have
lots of material.
You have material for days, man.
Oh, I'm sure I do. Yeah, just being a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because you kind of get jaded to the funny things, and someone would be like, anything interesting happened today? And I'm like, no. Well, I guess I had that one guy who thought he saw Santa Claus yesterday. But to like, it's kind of just lost its interest now. Like the interest is like, how do I get this guy better? Like you're kind of focused on like helping people rather than just the irony of the job.
If you just went up and said, here's what I thought today. Here's the things I didn't say today.
Right.
You'd be legend. You'd be a legend. You'd be a comic legend. I was going to say this today, but I didn't. Golly, man.
Oh yeah.
How do y'all two deal with dark humor?
What do you mean by that?
Meaning like the hardest I've ever laughed in my life to where I thought I was going to throw up. I was laughing so hard was dealing with the most grisly, wild crisis scenes. And I have to believe it was not prophylactic. It was protective.
Yeah.
But sitting in an alley with 2 police officers and 2 emergency responders, and we can't breathe because somebody got the giggles, and we all start laughing. And if anyone saw us, we'd be institutionalized because of what the scene that we're at, right? But I've learned that with first responders, with providers, there's a dark sense of humor that you have to kind of protect yourself because it sounds cruel and mean to the outside world, but I don't know. How do y'all handle that? Do y'all experience that or am I crazy?
Yeah, no, I think this happens in the psychiatry world for sure.
Yeah.
And you kind of told that line of like respect / this was funny.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think to a person who's not in that world, it only is disrespectful. It just feels cruel and disrespectful. Yeah. And it's like, no, I love this person with all my heart. I'm trying to do everything I can to help them.
Right. And so it's like if somebody said, I saw Santa Claus. Now my thought, my joke and treatment teams be like, I got to like dye my beard white so that, it's not like he's seen Santa
Claus. You just put on a red hat the next time.
Yeah. And we can make jokes. Yeah, I forgot my red hat, whatever. And you can kind of do it in a respectful way, though. It's still like funny. You probably wouldn't want to like advertise that we're all making these jokes, but they know do, yeah.
I probably like err on the side of caution right now as far as
y'all are better.
Until I'm a full-time comedian, I have to maintain a certain level.
There's got to be jokes going on during surgery, but they're probably not like about the patient. They're probably
right.
You remember that? That was a famous situation when a guy struggled coming out of anesthesia, so he put a recording device on him,
major
on
lawsuit.
And the surgeon was not in any way funny. It was just really crass and cruel. It was awful, but it was all recorded. And I mean, it was mean-spirited, making fun of this particular patient. And I hope that person doesn't have a license anymore. But that was a tough time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I always try to imagine, I wouldn't do that, but what if only say things that you would say if you're being recorded.
Being recorded, sure.
100%, yeah. And I don't think there's very many things said that if the patient was in the room, we wouldn't say.
No, not at all. And they would hopefully know you well enough to know, no, I'm with you. Yeah. I know you're having your worst time. I'm trying to bring the air up in the room, yeah.
Yeah. I would say the vast majority of my jokes are directed at the patients and not at the nurses. The nurses heard all mine and they're like,
Yeah. Or the way I like to say it is, no, the joke is with you. It's not at you. You're like, I don't like at people jokes. I like with people jokes.
Right.
Also, the patients, you got a fresh audience every patient.
Everyone,
like you haven't heard this one yet.
And we do have to, describe patients to other professional stuff. And so it's kind of the way you describe them, like they may be well nourished or they may have a biscuit poisoning.
That's right.
On the verge of biscuit poisoning. That's so it's, I'm not calling you fat. I'm not calling you. So it's how you approach things.
You're extra nutritionized.
Yeah. We definitely get a lot of doppelganger references too. Like, the Johnny Depp guy or the Santa Claus guy.
I would love to be the Johnny Depp guy. That'd be cool, man.
Right.
If I saw that Brad Pitt guy, I would be like, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any doppelgangers out there? People say I could be the next Dr. Ken. So I don't know if...
I like that.
Which we do have a lot of similarities. He's Ken, I'm Ben, both Korean, both doctors, both from Michigan, both moved to North Carolina. So
nice.
He's...
I get Guy Fieri a lot. I can kind of see it. Like if I had the right hair. Chino from the Deftones, I get a lot.
One of my heroes. Yeah. I get Robin Thicke a lot.
Oh my gosh. Yes, now that you said it.
I get that a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I can't sing or dance, and so it's tough for me. But
not to be confused with Alan Thicke.
No, I would take that too. I like Harry Potter also, so that'd be good also.
So
That's Harry Potter guy, right?
I think it was
Am I
like
right
a
on that?
TV dad.
Oh yeah. I was way off.
Alan Thicke.
Who's
Alan Rickman.
Rickman.
Oh,
yeah,
Alan
I
Rickman.
missed
I was
that
thinking
one.
Alan Thicke.
Yeah, Alan Thicke. Yeah.
Okay. All right. How's producer? How are we doing?
We're good. I didn't know if you guys want to talk about vaping. Maybe it's too long already, but kids are doing it.
Hot take. And I don't know if I believe this. My son's 15. I think there's a natural governor on cigarettes, meaning there's only so much your body can handle before you have some adverse physiological responses, right? You're going to start coughing your lungs out. You're going to feel sick. You're just going to feel bad. I don't think that same break applies to vaping, that you can just do that incessantly. So if I walked home and I saw 2 vape pens in my kid's drawer or a pack of cigarettes in his drawer, both of those we're going to have a conversation. You can't do those when you're in my house. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be more concerned out of the gate with the vaping, particularly because of how interchangeable it is. And you can't just smoke in somebody's car, and you can't just interchangeably you can pack cigarettes with marijuana, because my students used to do all the time, but you can't just do that in a green room, so like in a restaurant, and you can with vape. Mm-hmm. And so for me, out of the gate as a parent, I'm more concerned about that than I am about this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, cigarettes, I mean, they're made by one company, and it's going to be tobacco. With a vape, you're switching out cartridges. They have THC cartridges. They have nicotine cartridges. You can
who knows
have
what else?
anything. Who knows what else?
Varying degrees of plastic that you're melting and coating your lungs with. Like, I didn't think about
Quality
that. It's
control.
more of the wild, like cigarettes, evil, bad, dumb, all that. But it's a hyper-regulated industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're limited by the plant. Rather than some chemical that you could have up to 100% concentration.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't think about that either. Because that's been a conversation about marijuana that I've heard over and over, which is this is not your parents' weed that anybody's taking.
Even our plants are not the same. Yeah, the plants are not the same.
They're clinical grade, and it's a different level of potency.
How has the plant changed?
So we keep breeding higher THC levels. Yeah. THC levels are like astronomical now. It's not the same.
Wow.
And for a gummy candy aficionado like myself, that can get dangerous quick.
Yeah, which gummies were you referring to earlier?
Well, that's what I always hear. Like the colleagues I have that are like, yeah, we're going to go to Vegas and whatever. And you buy a gummy bear, but you only eat one leg. And I'm like, that's impossible for me. And they're like, you shouldn't get involved, because if you eat that whole thing, you're going to be on top of the roof trying to fly. So.
For someone with impulse control.
And a gummy candy.
And a gummy addiction.
Yeah.
Today we had the very hilarious Dr. John Deloney, mental health expert, dropping wisdom smoother than a perfect central line. Dr. John Deloney, where can our listeners find and follow you?
I'm on the internets.
Look for him on the internet.
Yeah, at John Deloney, you can find me there.
Is that this World Wide Web they talk about?
After you listen to the Dr. Ben podcast, and after you listen to the ADHD podcast, then you can come over and listen to the Dr. John Deloney show. Yeah.
I love it. All right, we had Dr. Brian, child and adolescent psychiatrist here. Thanks for being on the show. Anything you want to share with our listeners, and maybe where we can find you, or any advice?
Yeah, I mean, just stay healthy. You can find me online on the Raising ADHD podcast. It's on any podcasts or Instagram.
All right, listener, thank you. See you next week when I, Dr. Ben, and my
friends
help you put the med in comedy.